Long before hospitals, before antibiotics, before anyone understood that invisible germs cause illness, our ancestors lived in a world where a simple infection could be a death sentence, where a fever had no name and a wound could quietly kill. And yet, somehow, humanity survived. Not only survived, but spread across the entire planet, generation after generation, through plagues and parasites and injuries that we today would consider terrifying. So how did they do it? How did ancient humans survive disease in a world with no medicine as we know it? The answer is far richer and more surprising than you might expect, and it reveals that our ancestors were not the helpless victims of illness we sometimes imagine. They were resourceful, observant healers who had figured out far more than they are often given credit for. Let us start by being honest about how dangerous the ancient world really was, because that danger shaped everything. Without any understanding of germs, our ancestors faced infections, parasites, injuries, and illnesses with no clear idea of what was causing them. The evidence written in ancient bones tells a sobering story. Skeletons from the deep past frequently show signs of physical stress, of periods of sickness and malnutrition that left their mark on the growing body. Scientists can read these marks, lines in the teeth, changes in the bone, as a record of the hard times a person lived through. Many of these stress signals cluster around childhood, especially around the dangerous period of weaning, telling us that disease and hardship struck hardest at the young. This was a world where, as studies of both ancient remains and modern hunter-gatherers suggest, a large share of children never reached adulthood, and disease was one of the great reasons why. But here is where the story turns. Because faced with this constant threat, our ancestors did not simply give up and die. They observed, they experimented, and they learned. One of the oldest and most powerful tools in the human fight against illness was the natural world itself, in the form of plant medicine. Long before anyone could explain why, humans noticed that certain plants helped with certain ailments. A particular leaf might ease pain. A certain root might calm an upset stomach. A specific bark might bring down a fever. This knowledge was gathered slowly, through trial and error and careful observation, and then passed down across the generations, becoming a precious inheritance of healing wisdom. We have astonishing glimpses of just how old this knowledge is. When scientists examined the hardened plaque on the teeth of Neanderthals, they found traces of plants that have no real nutritional value but do have medicinal properties, suggesting that even these distant relatives of ours may have been using plants as medicine, deliberately taking them to treat their ailments. The famous Iceman, a naturally mummified man who died in the Alps thousands of years ago, was found carrying fungi that have known medicinal uses, possibly to deal with the intestinal parasites that scientists discovered in his gut. This points to something remarkable. Ancient humans were not just stumbling blindly through a world of disease, they were practicing a real, if early, form of medicine, built on generations of accumulated observation about which plants and natural substances could help the body heal. This pharmacy of the forest was their first and most important line of defense, and it was sophisticated enough that some of the plants they used contained compounds that modern science still recognizes as genuinely active. Beyond plant medicine, our ancestors developed a surprising grasp of wound care and even surgery. One of the most astonishing discoveries in all of archaeology is the evidence of a procedure called trepanation, in which a hole was deliberately cut into a living person's skull. We know these were not injuries because the bone around the holes often shows clear signs of healing, which means the patient survived, sometimes years afterward. Across many different ancient cultures around the world, people performed this dangerous operation, and remarkably, many of those who underwent it lived. This tells us that ancient humans had developed real techniques for cutting into the body, managing the procedure, and helping the patient recover. An extraordinary level of skill for a people with no understanding of modern anatomy or germs. Even more moving than the surgery itself is what all of this reveals about ancient human society, because survival of disease was never just about plants and procedures, it was about care. The bones of the ancient world tell us again and again that our ancestors looked after their sick and injured. Archaeologists have found skeletons of individuals who survived severe injuries or debilitating conditions, people who could not have fed or protected themselves, who lived on for years afterward. The only way that was possible is if other people cared for them, fed them, sheltered them, and kept them alive. This compassion is itself a survival strategy. A group that takes care of its sick keeps more of its members alive, preserves their knowledge and their contributions, and binds itself together more tightly. The simple, profound act of caring for the ill may have been one of the most important medicines our ancestors ever had. There were other defenses, too, woven into how our ancestors lived. For most of human history, people lived in small, mobile groups rather than crowded settlements. This way of life had a hidden benefit against disease, because many of the worst epidemic illnesses need large, dense populations to spread and sustain themselves. A small band of hunter-gatherers moving across the landscape was a much harder target for an epidemic than a packed city would later become. In a grim irony, some of the great waves of devastating infectious disease in human history came only later, after people settled down, began farming, and started living close together and alongside domesticated animals. The mobile, scattered life of our earliest ancestors offered a kind of natural protection that was lost when civilization arrived. It is important to be honest and balanced here, because none of this means the ancient world was healthy or safe. It was not. People suffered and died from conditions that we could cure today in an afternoon. Childbirth was dangerous, infections were deadly, and a bad injury far from help could easily be fatal. The plant medicines, however clever, were limited, and there was much our ancestors simply could not treat. The picture is not one of a lost paradise of natural health. It is one of resilient, intelligent people doing the very best they could with the knowledge they had, and managing, against long odds, to keep their species alive. And that, in the end, is the real triumph. Without any understanding of germs, without hospitals or pharmacies or trained doctors, ancient humans assembled a genuine system of survival against disease. They built a vast library of plant knowledge, passed down with care across the generations. They developed real techniques of wound care and even daring surgery. They protected themselves through their small, mobile way of life. And above all, they cared for one another, refusing to abandon the sick and the injured, keeping each other alive through compassion and cooperation. None of this was medicine in the modern sense, but all of it was healing, and all of it worked well enough to carry humanity forward. It is also worth appreciating how this ancient healing knowledge connects directly to the medicine we use today, because the link is more real than most people realize. Many modern drugs trace their origins back to plants, the very same kinds of plants that ancient and traditional healers used for thousands of years. Compounds first discovered in willow bark, in certain flowers, in molds and fungi, became some of the most important medicines in history. When we study the plant knowledge of ancient and traditional peoples, we are not just looking at a primitive curiosity, we are looking at the deep roots of pharmacology itself, a body of knowledge so valuable that scientists today still search traditional remedies for clues to new medicines. The healers of the ancient world, observing which plants eased which ailments and passing that knowledge down with care, were laying the very first foundations of a science that would one day fill our pharmacies. Their patient observation across thousands of years was, in its way, the beginning of medicine. There is also a quiet dignity in how our ancestors faced illness that deserves to be honored. In a world where so much sickness could not be cured, where the true causes of disease were invisible and unknown, people did not simply surrender to despair. They fought back with every tool they had: the plants of the forest, the careful tending of wounds, the patient nursing of the sick, the daring of surgery. And when a cure was beyond their reach, they offered something that has never lost its value, which is comfort and companionship in suffering. The same compassion that led them to feed and shelter the helpless also led them, surely, to sit with the dying and ease the passage of those they could not save. This blend of practical skill and deep human care is the true root of all medicine, and it was alive and well in our ancestors long before the first hospital was ever built. They could not always heal, but they could always care, and that too is a kind of medicine. So when we look back at our ancestors facing a world full of invisible dangers they could not name, we should not pity them as helpless, we should admire them. Every remedy they discovered, every wound they treated, every sick relative they nursed back to health was a small victory against a world that was constantly trying to take them down. They were the first doctors, the first nurses, the first pharmacists, working with nothing but observation, memory, and care. And the fact that you are here today, healthy enough to wonder about them, is the proof that their long, patient war against disease was, in the end, a war they managed to win.